Good afternoon, good evening, whatever space-time you are habitating. We have folks joining us from Japan, from West Coast, USA, from Mountain Time Zone, with Ron Lopez out there in Colorado, Western Time Zone, Pacific Time Zone with Dr. Saadia Pekkanen at the University of Washington, East Coast, and around the world. My name is Frank Januzzi. I'm president of the Mansfield Foundation. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's special discussion on U.S. Japan cooperation in space. The Marina Mike Mansfield Foundation was created by an act of Congress, but we are a private foundation. And our mission is to promote cooperation and understanding between the United States and our partners in Asia. We do this by honoring the ideals, values, and the vision of Marina Mike Mansfield through exchanges, dialogues, publications, working groups, all of it designed to create networks of problem solvers, to explore the underlying issues that drive critical public policy challenges for the United States and its partners in Asia. And with apologies to William Shatner, who turned 90 this week, today's event takes us to the realm of space policy, the final frontier. Our U.S. Japan Space Forum, so far our 7-year mission and still going, lost somewhere in space, has been to meet twice a year to examine the critical developments and opportunities for bilateral and even multilateral space-related activities. Our forum runs roughly parallel to the official U.S. Japan Track 1 comprehensive dialogue on space. Now, our mission has been to explore all 3 domains of space, by which I mean scientific space, commercial space, and security space, and to discover how the United States and Japan could do more together based on their common interests and complementary capabilities, frankly, to boldly go where no foundation has gone before, by bringing private sector voices, academic voices into the mix of U.S.-Japan space policy. Now, reflecting the increasingly important role of the private sector in space and in the development of national space capabilities, our forum is really designed to bring the top talent from the private and academic sectors into the dialogue. And we're able to do this because of the extraordinary network attached to the University of Washington, the Mansfield Foundation, and Keio University in Tokyo, represented by the 3 co-chairs of this Space Forum, myself on behalf of the foundation, Dr. Saadia Pekkanen, who joins us today, and Dr. Setsuko Aoki at Keio University, who's also a member of the Japanese Space Policy Committee. The ability to attract top talent to this forum is proven by the track records of some of its participants, including Dr. Hiroshi Yamakawa, one of the founding members of our forum, who is now the director of the Japanese Space Agency, JAXA, and Dr. Scott Pace, another founding member of our forum, who for the last 4 years has served as the secretary of the United States National Space Council. Today's event is made possible by the generous support of the Japanese Embassy in Washington, D.C. I want to thank them for their support. But the U.S. Japan Space Forum itself would not exist without support in the past from the Japan-U.S. Friendship Commission and continuing support from our private sector contributors, including Astroscale, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Mitsubishi Corporation, Mitsubishi Electric Corporation, IHI, Boeing, Raytheon, Harris, Honeywell, Lockheed Martin, NEC, Marubeni, a veritable who's who of U.S.-Japan space invested companies and industries. And I know that I've left a few off the list, and I apologize for that. This afternoon's program, to get right to it, you're going to hear from 2 voices from the U.S.-Japan Space Forum, who can speak both to the past, present, and the future of U.S.-Japan cooperation in space, and also share with you some of the exciting developments in space that are being driven forward in part through collaboration between the United States and Japan. We will first hear from Dr. Saadia Pekkanen, the co-chair of this forum. Dr. Pekkanen is Associate Director and founding Director of the Jackson School PhD program. She's the Job and Gertrude Tamaki Professor at the Jackson School of International Studies. Her work has been featured in Forbes magazine, where she's a contributing columnist. She's published the critical books examining the origins of the U.S. Japan space program and the cooperation and the intersection between Japan and the United States in space. I won't list all of her publications, but among them, well, let's see, which one should I pick? There's too many, but I like picking winners, from Technology Catch Up to the Space Race in Japan, from Stanford University Press back in 2003. Also joining us this afternoon, Ron Lopez, who is now at Astroscale and is a U.S. Air Force veteran who has worked with some of the, what we have called old space, but I shouldn't say that to their face, old space companies like Boeing and Honeywell, and is now in the vanguard of new space at Astroscale, devoted to the technologies necessary to clean space of the debris that we are creating as humans tend to create debris wherever we journey. But occasionally that debris becomes a hazard that needs to be removed, whether it's from the summit of Mount Everest or in low Earth orbit around the Earth. Ron, as I mentioned, a U.S. Air Force veteran. He's worked at both private sector and public sector jobs. He's a specialist in C4ISR and technology R&D management, and he's well positioned because of his longstanding years of work in Japan to be now at Astroscale, leading their U.S. office in, is it Boulder, Ron?
Denver.
In Denver, right in Denver. We're going to hear first from Dr. Pekkanen to give us the space view from higher altitude, perhaps, and then we're going to hear from Ron Lopez, and then we're going to take your questions. If you have questions, please populate the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, or you can put questions in chat. And before we begin, I also want to acknowledge both the role of Ryan Schaefer in helping, a former staff member of the foundation, to helping to create the U.S. Japan Space Forum, and then the continuing program management expert guidance provided by Kelly Primrose and Timothy White, foundation staff here in Washington, D.C., and also Saori Kobayashi, program associate director of programs in Tokyo. Without further ado, thank you so much, Saadia, for joining us. It's great to see you virtually, and the floor is yours for 15 minutes.
Thank you so much, Frank. Can you, before I begin, can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you 10 by 10.
Thank you. So thank you, first of all, Frank and the crew at Mansfield Foundation for making this event possible, and also all our many sponsors. I would say that this is an extremely important time to consider one of the most important issues around us today. That is the issue of how you build and sustain cooperation in this very dynamic and very multifaceted domain like space. From the perspective of the United States, I would say that Japan remains one of the world's most important bilateral relationships, bar none. And I'm going to discuss the importance of this historic and very widely quoted statement by Ambassador Mike Mansfield in the context of space, it's reflecting with you really on the present and future prospects for U.S.-Japan cooperation in space. I will begin by saying that there are many things on which to build that really bode well for the future of U.S.-Japan space cooperation, and on which both the United States and Japan can agree today. But I would also say, from my academic perch, that there are many differences and things to be cautious about in a changed and changing world order, and in a very dynamic and I would say also volatile space domain. In both countries, paying attention to these changes also requires us to be watchful about what may actually help to sustain cooperation between the two countries. Let me begin with four things involving both the US and Japan, and sort of crisscrossing back and forth, that I think we can usefully build on as platforms because they give us foundational building blocks and they clarify both present, past, as well as future prospects for sustaining cooperation. First, at the most general level, I would say that both countries can certainly agree that the new space race affords very exciting opportunities to build economic and industrial collaboration. If our evaluations and projections are correct, this is a dual use industry with implications for prosperity and defense that is worth over, I believe, $400 billion and is projected to reach, I think, $3 trillion or so in the near future. Now, second, with this, I think both countries can build on the fact that they have established and emerging commercial space players that are very well positioned to take advantage of these economic trajectories and projections. Let me name a few key players on both sides. I think we'll be hearing a little bit more about this from Ron as well. But I want to speak specifically about the ways that they're building cooperation among the US and Japan. As Frank said, my job is to sort of step up at the 30,000-foot level and look down and see what I see. On the US side, I would say that the US players, of course, include very well known players like SpaceX and Blue Origin, as well as other data-centric companies like Microsoft and Amazon that are also moving into the satellite business for communications, and Black Sky, for example, that is in the business of geospatial intelligence. Now, how are they building cooperation in these sectors? Let me point out something from SpaceX. Of course, as is well known, it has taken the worldwide lead in developing and ferrying commercial crew astronauts to the space station and likely beyond. And Japan is involved in this in a very important ground-up way. SpaceX commercial crew missions in a ground-up way because in a way that reflects the country's long-standing collaborations between NASA and JAXA on the International Space Station, on Gateway, and now also on the Artemis Accords. So on its first operational commercial crew mission in November 2020, a JAXA astronaut, Soichi Noguchi, flew to the space station alongside NASA astronauts. He's still there. And on his second commercial crew mission to the ISS, this is scheduled for April 20th, a JAXA astronaut, Akihiko Hoshide, will be part of the new crew with NASA astronauts as well as European astronauts from ESA. Now, on the Japan side, I would also say that there is a distinguished set of space technology players with very long histories, such as Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, IHI, Melco, NEC, all who have supported the U.S. Japan Space Forum, along with emerging players such as Astroscale, Axel Space, iSpace, and Synspective, who've also been with us in the forum. They too, of course, are positioned to compete in the new space race. And many of Japan's firms, I will not speak to Astroscale because I think Ron is going to tell us a little bit more about that. But let me point out a few ways in which Japanese companies have quietly made considerable headways. And these deserve close attention to the ways in which they are building cooperation platform between the two countries. One way I would say is that Japanese companies have advanced in the new space race and done so very quietly is through what we call the Japan Inside phenomena. That is where Japan plays to its strengths of constantly positioning in and dominating niches in supply chains. An example of this is Yuki Precision, which is a precision machining company that has been around, I believe, since the early 1960s. They supply machinery and components to Axel Space, one of the new space companies. I believe they have also, Ron, supplied you with machining parts. And of course, they are also have JAXA as a client. So watching the supply chains and how Japanese companies are positioning within that in both the old and new space players, I think is a very important trend to watch. Another way I would say that Japanese companies have forged forward and blended the old and the new is through strategic partnerships and buyouts across borders. Astroscale is a very good example of this. Again, I'll leave this for Ron to discuss. But one good example of this is certainly right here in Seattle, where we have Spaceflight, which serves as a launch broker and a services management platform. And after passing CFIUS review, I believe this was last year, this is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, Spaceflight is now wholly owned by Mitsui as well as Yamasa as of last year. So those are some of the ways that I think we can see commercial players actually building platforms for cooperation. A third big way that I think both countries agree, and this does present an opportunity to think about building platforms, is that there are threats in and through space that need to be dealt with. Setting aside, I would say, natural hazards, these threats comes not just from accidental, but also deliberate events. These threats, of course, are also amplified in a world that has returned to great power competition. And whatever their source, I would say that both countries can agree that outer space needs to be safe and secure to ensure the kind of prosperity and way of life that we have become used to. Again, let me point to a few ways in which there is a solid basis for cooperation. Of course, the US and Japan have a long history of technical and technological cooperation, including over ballistic missile defense since at least 2003. BMD, I would say, is a very important asset in building security in and through space, and joint work on this, of course, continues. Today, I think that trust and confidence among the two allies is also showing up in other public-private ventures that will help ensure this security. And I refer here to the announcement by the United States Space Force that has turned to using sensors on the quasi-zenith satellite systems that can complement the US GPS system. And the US will be launching US sensors on geosatellites with QZSS to monitor regional activities. I would say that a final building block for cooperation between both countries is military space collaboration. You can see I'm sort of drifting in that direction. Both the United States and Japan have set up dedicated military units for space that are new. We've had leadership from both come and speak to the U.S. Japan Space Forum. This is the U.S. Space Force, of course, and Japan Space Operations Squadron. And I think that they're building platforms for interoperability, as well as developing doctrines and strategies that showcase their various interests in using commercially driven technology platforms to counter threats such as orbital debris, as well as other events. So that is something that is ongoing and a platform that is actually being built up. So those, I think, are some of the very important ways that we have building blocks. Let me just end very briefly by talking about some significant differences and uncertainties that I think we also need to pay attention to as we think about the prospects for US-Japan cooperation in space. And of course, these are unfolding in this still pandemic-wrapped world. One thing I would say that we need to pay attention to is how Japan's geoeconomic strategy is aligned and whether that will reverberate in the substance and the US-Japan alliance going forward. Japan, for example, has signed an economic pact with China, and its own economic interests in a dynamic region go well beyond its relationship with just the US. I think the US has to work on engaging and also building economic modes of engagement in the region. Further, I would say that from an economic lens, Japan's, looking at it from Japan's side, I think Japan, of course, needs to be concerned about positioning with its ally, not just under the Biden administration, but really for what happens in the next election and after. So Japan's geoeconomic strategy may in fact reflect the realities of civilian, military, and space cooperation is something that we need to pay attention to. Another element that I think we need to pay attention to concerns the platforms through which the US and Japan can build concrete cooperation. In other words, platforms for building space diplomacy at a time when, unfortunately, the value of both international law and diplomacy appear to have declined worldwide. So I'm talking beyond the two countries' comprehensive US-Japan space dialogue, which Frank mentioned, the SSA agreements, the QZSS agreements, and so on. So where are they, these platforms? Well, Japan has, of course, something that is called the Asia-Pacific Regional Space Agency Forum that dates back to 1993. China also has something called the Asia-Pacific Space Cooperation Organization. The United States does not have anything equivalent to engage partners and build coalitions. We're also uncertain about the future of the National Space Council, which did a fantastic job in whole of government leadership. So I will say in ending that we have this at the US-Japan Space Forum. in which we do have a durable way to engage with a wide variety of public, private, and academic stakeholders from both countries. And I believe that it can play an important role in the two countries as they continue to forge their relationships in the space domain. Thank you for listening to me. I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Saadia. A terrific overview of the importance of U.S.-Japan space cooperation and the domains in which we are cooperating, but also you touched on the tools necessary to sustain and strengthen that cooperation. The need for an all-of-government approach, because space touches every aspect of our lives, not just military space or commercial or science, but really it's ubiquitous. But also your attention to the safe and secure environment in space, something which ultimately is the domain of all humankind and requires multilateral cooperation as well. And you pointed out Japan's efforts to participate in such multilateral fora. And this is an area where perhaps the Biden administration, which touts itself as being committed to multilateralism, may engage in ways that the previous administration did not. But nonetheless, this is an area where the United States has not yet shown leadership. Now we're going to turn to one of the experts in resiliency and safety in space. From the earliest days of our forum, we have been concerned with how space can be protected so that we can continue to use it. And protecting it from debris is one of the core missions of Astroscale, Ron Lopez company. Ron, the floor is yours for 15 minutes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Frank. First of all, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you, and I apologize for some audio challenges earlier in my presentation. I think we have those sorted.
No. I always ask because it doesn't matter how many of these virtual calls I do in a day, and I do a lot. It just seems like I always forget to hit the mute button or something. So great. Well, thank you very much to the Mansfield Foundation for inviting me to speak on this panel. It's great to be back in action with Frank and Saadia, colleagues whom I've worked with for many years. Unlike my esteemed colleagues, though, I decided to wear corporate formal wear today, otherwise known as corporate t-shirts. So I hope you'll all forgive me for that. I'm usually in a coat and tie looking kind of dapper. Anyhow, so today, as Frank mentioned, I wanted to, I really don't want to get too in the weeds, leave maybe that for some of the Q&A at the end, and instead take a complementary look at the U.S.-Japan relationship in space, complementary to the comments that Saadia just gave, and really talk or address, from my perspective, the complexity of that relationship. And it's complex because it cuts across various dimensions. There's many different ways to look at it. I guess the first way in which that collaboration happens is the different what I would call the market segments, which Frank addressed in his opening remarks, right? You have science and exploration, which is the civil engagement part of it. As an example, what the two nations are doing on Artemis. You have commercial space, the old and the new. And as Saadia pointed out, there's a lot of new space, a lot of investment going into new space in the US and in Japan significantly. And then the third one, national security, which has always existed, but is relatively new in terms of the amount of focus and energy. And as you can probably gather from the number of times that that came up in Saadia's comments. So that's traditionally the way we think about space exploration. One other way that, space collaboration. One other way that collaboration happens is via different capability areas. So, for example, launch. There's a very long history of collaborating on launch and launch technology. Space situational awareness, tracking what's in space and understanding what's going on in space. Hot area for collaboration. And then, as Frank mentioned, of course, debris removal, a topic that is becoming more and more important. In addition, the nature of the interactions themselves are sometimes very different. We have government to government engagement, we have government to industry engagement, we have industry to industry engagement. And for any one of those, that the nature of that relationship might be contractual or it might be collaborative. So just because it's government industry doesn't mean that there's a contract. It might be a collaborative effort. And each one of those comes with its own unique dynamics. And then finally, we can look at this through the lens of the functional areas, for lack of a better term, in other words, collaboration in policy, collaboration on technology, and collaboration in business. And that's what I want to drill down on a little bit more. So taking those three kind of in reverse order there, first with business, there's a lot of high quality products and services on both sides of the Pacific, in Japan and the US, and therefore there are a lot of value-added supplier relationships on both sides, and companies helping each other be more cost-effective, more competitive, and that's a great thing. And the good thing, being both having capitalist forms of economics, that engagement typically happens pretty organically through the forces of the market. Secondly, we have technology, and that can come in a lot of different forms, technology transfer, co-development of new intellectual property, and any number of different ways that we can approach the development of new technology. This is probably the area that gets the most attention when we talk about bilateral collaboration. What is it that we're going to make is the first thing that people focus on. And so therefore, it's probably the thing that I'm going to focus on the least in my comments here. If you want to know more, there are experts out there. Mike Fletcher of former NASA fame, a former Mansfield fellow. He is, I believe, in the audience with here today. Great resource to pick his brains. He probably knows more than anybody else about U.S. Japan bilateral collaboration on technology and space. So I want to focus a little bit more on that third pillar, policy collaboration in the policy domain. It's probably one that doesn't get a lot of attention, but one that, in my view, I think has evolved the most over the last decade. And it's absolutely critical to developing standards and norms of behavior to ensure safe operation in space. As the two largest economies in the free world, I believe that Japan and the U.S. have a responsibility to show leadership in this area. And in fact, I think we can point to a lot of great examples where the Japanese government is leaning forward and showing leadership. One of those, of course, is in the area of space debris, an issue which is very near and dear to my heart. It's a problem that's becoming increasingly critical, increasingly problematic. There's a lot of new mega constellations that are going to be going up, which is great because these add economic value, but we also have to be cognizant of the challenges that they pose from a debris perspective. Case in point, just over the course of the last week, there have been two satellite breakups. A NOAA satellite broke up last week, and a 2-year-old Chinese satellite, Yunhai 1-02, broke up. And I think collectively between the two of them, we now have close to 40 different individual pieces of space junk that are floating around in their own individual orbits, which obviously pose, and these are in congested orbits, by the way, which pose a threat to other satellites. Not to fear, of course, we have ELSA D to the rescue. Saadia mentioned Astroscale and what we're doing on the debris. So just one quick comment there. ELSA D, which is our end-of-life services by Astroscale demonstrator satellite, just launched earlier this Monday into an orbit of 550 kilometers. And we have successfully made contact with the satellite. And over the course of the next several months, we will be conducting a series of experiments to show how we can dock with and remove debris. So we as a company are obviously very excited about it. It was a very international effort. The satellite was manufactured in Japan, being managed. The mission is being managed out of the UK. It was launched out of Kazakhstan. Obviously, we're supporting that effort here as well. So that's one example of the kinds of things that our industry is bringing to the table. And I think industry is uniquely capable of bringing to the table in terms of finding practical solutions to some of these problems that we see evolving. So going back to Japan's leadership in the policy area, the Japanese government featured space debris as a policy priority at the G20 meeting that they hosted in, I believe, 2019 in Nagoya. They are very actively engaged in UN at UN COPUOS, and JAXA has actually awarded the first active debris removal contract, public-private partnership that they call CRD2, or the commercial removal of debris demonstration. Phase one, which Astroscale is executing on, to go up and inspect a H2 rocket body, and then phase two, which will be awarded later, will be to actually go up and grapple that piece of debris and bring it down. So the Japanese government actually putting its money where its mouth is, which is great. And then a third area of policy focused, which Saadia spoke about quite a bit, is national security. And of course, national security has always been an element of space activities in the US. In Japan, I believe there's been a landmark shift over the last decade, starting with the Basic Space Law of 2008, which really changed the dynamic in Japan, among other things, allowing JAXA to be engaged in national security initiatives. Just a quick anecdote from my own personal perspective, right? When I was a young lieutenant captain in Japan many years ago, the notion of national space security, space in general, but certainly anything to do with JAXA related to national security was absolutely taboo. And I went back about 2 decades later as a business development guy working for Boeing. People were starting to warm up to the idea and talk about it. And by the time I left 8 years later, JAXA was absolutely 100% engaged on national security issues. So it's great to see how that transformation has taken place over a relatively short period of time. Of course, the focus in Japan is still on the peaceful uses of space that support national security, which is great. Things like space situational awareness, and which is absolutely critical because that supports spaceflight safety, as Frank mentioned earlier. So the bottom line is that there is a lot going on. These interactions are complex and they are robust. Space is consistently a topic of a priority topic of interest on the 2+2 agenda. For those of you that are not aware of the 2+2, it's the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Secretary of State, and the two defense counterparts, Secretary of State and Minister of Defense, who meet. The most recent meeting was just last week in Tokyo, and they reaffirmed that long-standing cooperation in defense in general, but in space specifically. And I'd like to point out that this was the first overseas ministerial or cabinet level trip by President Biden's cabinet members since his inauguration 2 months ago. So great to see that happened in Japan. I'd also like to point out that these are the only two nations that have a comprehensive government dialogue on space, a comprehensive dialogue on space. And the Mansfield Foundation's U.S. Japan Space Forum essentially acts as a track to dialogue supporting that government-to-government comprehensive dialogue. So we're proud to be part of that as well. So there's a lot going on, but we need to do more. And so if anything, I didn't want to approach this as just sort of a rehash of everything that's going on, but make this really a call to action. We need to do more. So revisiting those pillars that I talked about, first, business ties will continue to evolve naturally. So as long as we let business do their thing, I don't think there's much to worry about. However, we must come up with frameworks and constructs that enable more effective and efficient technology collaboration on space issues. First, we have to identify what the priorities are. What are the comparative advantages that Frank talked about? Saadia talked about the different niches that Japanese companies really get good at. What are those comparative advantages? Where can we add value to what the other side is doing? We also have to work to resolve roadblocks. For example, come up with a more rational, streamlined export control regulations that recognize the deep level of trust between the two nations. And then finally, we must continue to collaborate on policy development and establishing the rules of the road for space operation in space. That means coordinating unilaterally on space initiatives, working bilaterally when we need to, but really focusing on multilateral and international initiatives to push our common agenda forward, engaging through international fora such as UN COPUOS, which I mentioned earlier, the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee, and many others. I'd also like to caution, though, that when we talk about collaboration in space policy, that this is not just a government-to-government thing. that industry has to be brought into it, that industry viewpoint, to ensure that industry expertise that speaks to technological innovation, business objectives, et cetera, is present, so that the policies that our nations and International Fora Institute are compatible with those business objectives, so that the space economy can actually grow to that forecasted $3 trillion that Saadia spoke about earlier. That's the only way it'll happen. So I'll stop there, and I welcome your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Ron. And whether you know it or not, you were quite brilliantly integrating in your presentation answers to a couple of the questions that we've already received in the chat box. We had in the chat from Michael Fletcher, a former Mansfield Fellow and NASA attaché in Tokyo, the question about the barriers to promoting international collaboration, including in the B2B area. And you touched on it when you addressed issues of export control reform, because all nations restrict technologies that can be licensed for export. But with trusted partners like Japan, the United States needs to ensure that our export control laws do not stand in the way of necessary and productive, efficient collaboration between our private sectors. I've heard the shorthand phrase used of higher fences, smaller plots, to try to ensure that those technologies that truly must remain protected and within national control are protected, but that we don't stifle cooperation in other areas. But I know that you have also done some work and paid attention to issues of procurement policies and harmonizing standards and norms to allow Japanese and American companies to bid on each other's national projects. And I was wondering if you and Saadia might take on that piece of this question, because especially in America today, with Buy America provisions and a sense of the United States wanting to ensure that our tax dollars are supporting jobs in America, I think there are reservations about allowing foreign companies, however friendly the governments might be, to bid on and potentially outbid American companies. And I think the same might be true in Japan in terms of wanting to protect core industrial capacities. But is there a way around that, Ron and Saadia, where we can try to ensure collaboration while protecting the industrial bases of both countries? Let me start with you, Ron, and then to Saadia.
Yeah. Thanks, Frank. That's the perfect setup for one of my stumping points that I like to get up on my soapbox and talk about. First, real briefly on the ITAR thing. Look, export controls are a good thing because they keep critical technology from getting into bad guy hands. The U.S. government for sure has tried to get a lot of stuff over to the Export Administration Regulations and off of ITAR over the last many years, which is great. And the truth is that in my many years of working bilateral stuff with Japan, I don't personally have never seen an export license, an ITAR export license to Japan denied, right? So it's just a question of working through the process and the amount of time it takes. So hopefully both governments will get better there. But back to the main thrust of your question. Part of it is structural, the reluctance, and especially on national security space initiatives, the reluctance is sometimes structural, sometimes it's cultural, right? Because there's a natural bias to think that it's a zero-sum game. And if there's X amount of budget on a government program, if you give some to the guys over there, it's going to be less for me. I think that's a very parochial way at looking at it, and businesses really have to approach this from the perspective of what's going to deliver the best capability to the customer, and the customer in this course, of course, being government. So just looking at it from the very critical lens of national security space, right? Saadia mentioned this in her opening remarks. It's a dangerous, contested, congested environment, right? The space threat is increasing, and we have to be vigilant and be able to address it. At the same time, taxpayer dollars are very limited, right? And governments have a responsibility to make sure that those taxpayer dollars, both in Japan and the US, are spent as efficiently and effectively as possible. And so I think it's really a win-win. We have to think about this as a win-win when we can find out what are those guys over there more capable at than we are over here. What technologies do they have that can really add value? bring it in, do it in a way that addresses valid security concerns, but there are ways to do that. Bring that in and deliver a value-added, more effective product to our national security establishment, right? That delivers better capability at lower cost. So we have to look at it from the bigger picture perspective and start really thinking about this as a bilateral win-win from a national security perspective, because that's what we want.
Thank you, Ron. Saadia, your thoughts on this, the barriers to cooperation?
Yeah, so I'm really glad that Ron gave us the building blocks for thinking about how cooperation can take place among these two allies, the US and Japan. It's great that, I don't know either, Ron, whether any kind of export licenses have been denied to Japan, but I also mentioned that the two countries have a long history of building technical and technological cooperation. BMD is just one of them, and so it goes from there, right? And so today, when we take a look at something in an era in which we're all fiscally constrained, I think when you are taking a look at something like working with Japan on, for example, QZSS, building out awareness of, as Ron was saying correctly, where exactly can we sort of make a difference? How exactly can we use the competences on both sides, both in the US and Japan? And I think that QZSS and building space domain awareness, necessary for almost everything else that goes on, is a very important step forward. So I would say the biggest barrier in my mind, it came to me this morning when I saw that that the public doesn't understand the importance of why building space domain awareness might be important. So Ron was saying earlier, you need to build, norms and rules and understanding. I would say that is job number one. And the reason why it's job number one is because if you take a look at what happened in the Suez Canal this morning, I don't know if you followed, there's a tanker that's stuck, this 400-meter tanker. And so everything behind it is backlogged. They can't get out of the. So imagine if something like that happens in space. A lot of what we are dependent on in terms of our, almost like a utility, right, would really just shut down. So how do you convince the public to, what is the political messaging that is there and that's necessary for governments to do? And I think Japan has done an exceptional job on orbital debris. And it has, as Ron pointed out, and they're at Astroscale is sort of at the cutting edge of some of what we're seeing in terms of orbital debris spread around the world. So they're not just in Japan, they're in the US, they're in the UK. They're really helping to sort of push this forward. And yes, Japan can use things like its focus on orbital debris, but it can also build that collaboration with its partners in Asia through something like APRSAF. And they are beginning to do that, and they're going to do that well. And that's how I think the message will move forward. I think that's the building block that we need to think about carefully.
Thanks so much, Saadia. You've touched on the norms and policy-making legal dimensions of space policy, and the fact that the US and Japan need to be cognizant of how they have both the capability to help set norms as two of the leading space nations, but they're also operating within a space environment that is currently a little bit like the Wild West in its lawlessness, in the absence of internationally accepted norms on everything from, does a space launch, must that satellite require a end-of-life service plan? Or is it okay to just send something up and hope for the best? Can you put weapons in space, and who decides? I would like you, Saadia, if you could, to look a little bit over the horizon at the policy-making imperative to help establish international norms for this congested and threatened space environment upon which we rely. And if you could give advice to the Biden administration, one of our questioners says, what would you like to see the Biden administration do with respect to future, U.S. space policy and leadership, especially another question from Catherine Cook, leadership in terms of regional fora, international fora that might be trying to seek consensus on the norms of space. And not to belabor the point, but there has been an absence of consensus. The Europeans have some notions about space policy. The Chinese and the Russians have put forward some ideas. The US and the Japanese have some ideas, but there has been so far a failure of international collaboration to set and agree upon norms that can be set down to govern conduct in space.
So I think that one place to start is to have a whole of government approach, like a National Space Council that did do a good job in sort of bringing attention to specific avenues and aspects where people looking from the outside at the United States could say, there's the place to go to in case we want to build a partnership with the US or something. Absent US leadership at that whole of government level approach, I think what we're going to see is the kind of thing where DARPA, for example, helped fund something like Confers, where you get private and public stakeholders to come together and begin to build the rules of the road, the space traffic management ideas that can then go into place, hopefully, as the evolution of small satellites and mega satellites, et cetera, continues. So I would say that the US sort of needs to think very carefully about where that window of operation is, that everybody looking around from outside the world can say, that's where we can sort of begin to think about building relationships with the US. I think over the past, despite the work of, I would say, the National Space Council, I think it is fair to say that both diplomacy as well as international diplomacy as well as international law took a hit under the previous administration. If the issue is now to resurrect it, I think what we need to think about again is a whole of government approach that can sustain beyond just the Biden administration, because every partner looking at the US from outside is positioning not for now, not for with the Biden administration, they're positioning for 4 years from now. So how do we ensure that there is some sort of window, some sort of place where our partners can look to and that can remain stable? And I think that this goes beyond just the United States Space Force, for example, is running around talking about doctrines that have to do with building partnerships and alliances. So General Armagno, who came to talk to us at the University of Washington, said it very clearly, and I think very well. In space, we don't go alone. We can't go alone. We have to go in space with other partners. So the question is, how do we build those partners? What role do military stakeholders are playing in those partners? What can the Biden administration do to bring those capabilities and the military stakeholders with the civilian, with the commercial stakeholders in a single place of operation with which then our partners can engage?
Thank you, Saadia.
Yeah.
Saadia says that we don't go alone, or you're quoting.
I'm quoting General Armagno. Yes.
And that we don't go alone in space, and that's true. But we don't go with China. And so, Ron, can I ask you, if we're striving to establish norms, I think we have to also accept that one of the drivers of Japan's willingness to move from just science space and commercial space into security space has been its awareness of the threats to its space assets upon which it relies for its national security, emanating from new space actors, including China. And those threats are both physical, as we saw with anti-satellite destruction testing by the Chinese government, but also cyber. And we've got a couple of questions in the chat about cyber and space. But in an environment in which the United States and Japan are viewing China with skepticism as a threat to the resiliency and the sustainability of our space assets, how can we attempt to go into space not alone but in partnership, and in partnership in a way that might ultimately bridge some of those differences and bring the Chinese on board to these global norms about the use of space? I'm not asking you to be Secretary of State, really, Ron, but give us a little bit of your thoughts about how to manage the challenge of China on cyber and in cooperation on establishment of space norms. I know this is an area you've addressed in the past.
Sure. Yeah. Well, for the record, I kind of do like the sound of Secretary Lopez. I don't know. Just joking. Yeah. So, first and foremost, Frank, if I had to sum up my answer in one word, transparency, right? Nobody stands to gain anything by having a space environment where there is ambiguity, because ambiguity contributes to that fog and friction of war. It causes animosity and distrust, and leads us down a path where that I think we don't want to go. Right. So transparency and leadership through example. So in your previous questions, Saadia, you talked about the fact that there is a lack of consensus. You worked at state for many years. You're very, very familiar with, lack of consensus in the international scene is nothing new, right? And it will continue to be the reality of the world that we live in. So I agreed 100% with everything Saadia said. I think we need to, in addition to continue to work with like-minded nations, those that are willing to come along and do the things that those like-minded nations believe are in the best interest of preserving the space environment for everybody's peaceful use, and then leading by example. And then hopefully those are the actions through leading by example, being transparent. It's really hard to hide stuff in space, right? It's not like there's a bunch of trees or mountain or hills that you can hide behind. So establishing that transparency will, I think, help engender trust and help ultimately over the long term bridge some of those gaps. And I think everybody wins as a result.
Frank, can I say something just to follow up from that? So I also agree with Ron 100%, which is that what we are looking at is building space domain awareness. This can't be done by just one country alone. It can't be done by governments alone who are fiscally constrained. This has to be a public-private partnership across borders with like-minded countries who can sort of take the next steps to establishing norms and rules of behavior in space. Absent that, I think because of the kinds of, well, it's already a very hazardous environment, yes? Coupled with that, the breakups that we are beginning to see from older technologies, plus the fact that there are destructive acts that are taking place. It's not just, ASAT tests are not just being carried out by China. India has also demonstrated this. The US also certainly has that. So I think that we need dedicated platforms that can help bring these kinds of actors together to build, as Ron is saying, transparency through space domain awareness. And I think that that's really the way forward. I do believe the US can take, be an important leader in this, given the weight that it has in the space domain. But again, to quote General Manyo, it can't do it alone. And, it's not sustainable to do it alone. This has to be done with like-minded partners and allies. So I would leave it there.
Both of you have, distinguished between the ability to be aware of what's in space, space situational awareness and space domain awareness, the ability to perceive transparently space assets, what they're up to, how they're moving, deconfliction in terms of trying to avoid collisions. Excuse me. But there is sort of this next phase from being aware of what's up there and its vulnerabilities to actively managing the space environment, space traffic management, and coordination of launches and standards of debris removal. And that seems to me to require a level of international cooperation, information sharing, at least, and collaboration that we don't have yet. There is the Joint Space Operations Command established by the United States in partnership with its allies, and Japan is now a participant in that process of observing space and providing alerts to commercial satellite operators about potential collisions. But we don't really have a global system, do we? And shouldn't we? In our last few minutes, if I could ask each of you to try to just highlight what are the core either new policy areas or technology areas that you believe we should be prioritizing in the U.S. Japan cooperative space realm, to better prepare both nations for the space environment that is coming at us. If you could help to steer the policy priorities of the Biden administration, the Suga administration, what would you be bringing to their attention? And then we'll close after that. And let me ask you to start, Ron.
Sure. Let's see. Wow, there's so many ideas floating through my head as you were saying that. Yeah. So first, I agree with Saadia, right? Space traffic management, job number one. I'm sure civil aviation went through a similar evolution as airplanes started flying without much regulation, and over the course of time, individual countries and eventually international forums adopted best practices to ensure the safety of the flying public. I think we're going to see a similar evolution happen internationally within the U.S. Of course, space. And I might need to correct myself later. Right? I think the Space Directive 3, right, that mandated that we do something about space traffic management. Department of Commerce is taking the lead on that. There is a slow transition of space situational awareness capabilities away from the U.S. military to Department of Commerce. Kevin O'Connell, when he was in that position at Department of Commerce, I think did a fantastic job. Hopefully DOC will continue that. Exactly where that responsibility will fall is still a little bit unclear, whether it'll be Department of Commerce or the FAA. As long as somebody owns it and does something with it, I think that's fantastic. And hopefully then we'll start building these sort of international norms that are required to get there. So absolutely, positively has to be a high priority from a policy and a technology perspective, and then business will come with solutions. There's any number of different technology. You asked about technology, so to address that question directly, there's any number of different technology areas that I think are important. In situ space situational awareness, I think, is an important one, right? So right now our SSA capabilities are very much ground-based, radars and telescopes looking up. The ability to complement our understanding of what's happening in the space environment with close-in inspection for the purposes of attribution and when something happens, and safety. And attribution can be both from a threat perspective or from an insurance perspective, and something malfunctions on the satellite. I think in situ space situational awareness capabilities is an area that we're going to see a lot of movement in the future. We're certainly looking at that and doing things in that area as well. And then you mentioned cybersecurity in passing related to one of the other questions. It's going to be absolutely critical that the space community really beef up cybersecurity and for obvious reasons. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Ron. And I hope cybersecurity might be an issue that the Mansfield Foundation Space Forum will delve more deeply in the future. Clearly one of the emerging priorities for the Alliance in space. And Dr. Aoki has joined us from Tokyo, and I feel compelled, because it's 3:30 in the morning there, that I must get her question into the mix, and especially because it's a very forward-looking, hopeful and exciting question, which has to do with Artemis and the fact that the U.S. and Japan are working to get back to the moon and beyond through the Artemis project. And she would like us to take note that Japan has made a very significant investment, beefing up its space budget in order to participate in Artemis. And maybe as we close this out, Saadia, you might speak to sort of the promise of Japan, even though its budget on space is smaller than that, significantly smaller than that of the United States, but the really vital contributions that they're making to a high priority U.S. mission to put a woman on the moon and to return to the moon after a long absence.
Yeah. First, thank you, Frank. And first, let me just say that I agree with Ron also about STM and with Setsuko about the importance of looking beyond our concerns with safe and stable orbits to what's going to come beyond that. And that Artemis Accord, as well as the U.S. Japan Cooperation on doing something with respect to human exploration and settlement, I think is extremely important going forward. I mentioned that Japan has already partnered and its astronauts have gone up on the commercial crew missions with SpaceX. So that speaks to the very long-standing cooperation that has been built on both sides. And I think that as they figure out the rules and norms, not just in orbits, but also what will be happening on the moon and beyond, I think Japan will be an important partner for the US as we move forward. So I think I will leave it there. Yeah.
Well, we have reached the appointed hour. I want to thank Dr. Saadia Pekkanen, Ron Lopez for joining us this afternoon, this morning, this evening. Space is a domain without which the planet could not currently survive. When Dr. Pekkanen was talking about the Suez Canal, I was reminded of how annoyed I get when my Zoom link is disrupted even momentarily. But imagine a world in which satellite communications, satellite movement of documents and finances, and satellite security devices, Earth observation satellites, ballistic missile defense warning satellites were taken offline. And what a different world and what a threatening and scary place that would be for all of us. So working together with partners like Japan, the United States has an important role to play in space. That's why the Mansfield Foundation is proud to join with the University of Washington and Keio University, Dr. Pekkanen, Dr. Aoki, and talented folks like Ron to help explore how we can do more together in space. I want to thank all of you for joining this discussion. Stay tuned for additional seminars sponsored by the Japanese Embassy in Washington, D.C. That are highlighting the vibrancy of the U.S.-Japan relationship as we prepare to welcome Prime Minister Suga to Washington next month for the first official state visit by a foreign leader to the Biden administration to Washington, D.C., following up on what Ron Lopez mentioned as the first official travels by the U.S. Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense to allied nations abroad. We're very excited to be working on the most important bilateral relationship, bar none, that the United States has. And with that, words of pride from the foundation and thanks to all of our sponsors of the U.S. Japan Space Forum, I want to thank our audience for joining, and I want to thank our Mansfield Foundation staff for helping to facilitate every aspect of the program. And we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Frank. Thank you. Thank you, Ron. Great to see you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.